Hello, and welcome to Scrumcast, a series of conversations with thought leaders who have successfully transformed organizations and empowered teams and individuals across industries with Agile and Scrum. I'm your host, Tom Bullock, and in this episode, we're going to get tactical. We're going to dig into three very important but often overlooked elements of a product backlog item: the definition of ready, acceptance criteria, and definition of done. The product backlog items of high-performing teams and organizations have these elements, and they know how to create and use them effectively. But if your product backlog items lack them, or if they're ill-defined, well, let's just say you're not setting yourself up for success. Why? Well, I've invited two of Scrum Inc.'s thought leaders here to answer that question and give us some pro tips on how to make sure your definition of ready, acceptance criteria, and definition of done empower high performance. Kevin Ball is a consultant, coach, and trainer with Scrum Inc. And since we are still working remotely and technical problems can happen, Kevin is joining us by video and on his phone for audio. Hey, Kevin.
Hey, Tom. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for finding ways to adapt and overcome the situation. And Jack Harmoning is also a consultant, coach, and trainer with Scrum Inc. And Jack, I'm glad everything's working well for you.
Thanks, Tom.
And thank you both for being here. But we're going to start with this before we drill down. For those who are just new to Scrum or who don't fully know all of the nomenclature yet, what is a product backlog item, or PBI?
Really simply put, a product backlog item is the elements that make up your backlog. And the backlog are the body of work that you're doing for one particular time box of work. Simple as it.
And by time box of work, you mean we normally call it a sprint, a set amount of time in which that work needs to be able to be accomplished.
Absolutely.
And PBIs, or product backlog items, are then prioritized by the product owner, and that makes the product backlog, and part of that will get pulled into each sprint, becoming the sprint backlog, which means what? What is a sprint backlog?
A sprint backlog is what the team will prioritize to kick off that time box work, and it's called ready backlog. That's the definition of ready. But all the individual product backlog items have all the ingredients they need to get the work done.
So you actually, Kevin, just stepped right on my next question, which is that definition of ready. So for a product backlog item to be worked on by the team, which of course is the goal, the purpose, what everything is about, they need to know that definition of ready. So explain that more fully for us. Jack, what is a definition of ready?
So the definition of ready, to give it a sense of perspective, when we create these PBIs, we have to choose our language. We have to choose how we're going to write them. And our definition of ready is the specific portion of that language that helps us understand if we actually can do this work. So it's one thing to write a story and have this kind of idea in your head about what you want done. It's another thing to start to shape that to the point where a team can take that in and actually say, yeah, this is something we can do in a sprint.
And Kevin, basically what Jack just laid out there is a definition of ready is what is needed by the team in terms of understanding to make sure that they have the skills to do the work and they have the time to finish the work in a specific sprint. Is that right?
That is correct. And just to kind of build on what Jack said a little bit more, we have this acronym called INVEST. The I in INVEST, I'm going to tell you what the two most important things are. The I in INVEST is immediately actionable. The product backlog item has everything it needs. One of the team members can pull the work in and get it done. The T in INVEST is testable. It can also be tested within the sprint. Also negotiable, open discussion is valuable to the customer. That's the V. E is the team can estimate it. And S is for small up to fit in the sprint. But two things you want to take away from this is, one, the I is you can act on it immediately, and it's testable.
Yeah. So a good definition of ready then makes sure that everybody on the team understands what needs to be accomplished for that piece to be, what needs to be done in that piece of work, that product backlog item. So what components, individual components, would you say make up a great definition of ready?
Oh, thanks. It's basically what you said. I'm just trying to plus one. It's that INVEST criteria, right? So we begin and end with our immediately actionable and our testable, because that tells us a lot about how the story enters our work stream and how it exits our work stream. But those middle parts tell us a lot about the quality of the thing itself, right? Negotiable means it's open to discussion. We're not being dictated to. We can actually use the elements of our team to talk about it, right? We can have a conversation within our team about how this work should be done. The valuable to the customer. We're not working on something that's going to go nowhere or sit and collect dust on a shelf. And then we have our estimable by the team and small enough to fit in the sprint. Those are both related, right, to that immediately actionable, but ultimately comes down to, is this a bite that we can even take, right? We don't want to take on too much. We want to actually be able to process this information and get this work done.
And that negotiable in particular means context. It gives the team the ability to
Mm-hmm.
figure out where it all fits in and ask
Right.
important questions. So what can make a definition of ready? It sounds very straightforward, but what makes one go bad?
Here we are. Good question, Tom. If you don't have acceptance criteria in that PBI, in that product backlog item, that acceptance criteria is really, really important, because if you think about what the customer wants or what the stakeholder wants from that one story that we're pulling in, that one product backlog item, we need to know when it is done. So if you think about acceptance criteria, so because forward facing, like what can be tested in the sprint, and what's sort of that checkoff list that's going to be valuable to the customer.
Yeah. Can I add to that a little bit? Another thing that I've seen as a common pitfall is when you have cross-team collaboration that's necessary to get a project done. A lot of times people will have definitions of ready, and they'll have their definitions of done, which is a similar concept, but they won't talk to each other about how to align those two things. So if my team needs to talk to another team to get something done, then they need to know about our definitions of ready. They need to know what we have written down. It can't just be, again, sitting on a shelf somewhere. We need to communicate those ideas to each other so that when the work comes in, it's ready to go for us.
So what I love is...
Just to put a fine point on it, Tom, just real quick, a fine point on it. The acceptance criteria is what the customer needs. The definition of done is what the organization needs.
Well, we're going to get to both of those. And actually what I was going to say is I love it when you start seeing all these pieces fit together, literally not just in the structure of our conversation, but in the answers themselves. So the next thing we want to tackle is that acceptance criteria. And that is, and we'll get into, it's easy to confuse with definition of done. We'll get into definition of done here in a moment. But the acceptance criteria is what?
It needs to be testable. You have to have the criteria in order for it to be complete. So it promotes test-driven development. So if you have your acceptance criteria built into the story, we know exactly what kind of hoops we need to jump through. We know exactly what gates need to be closed and completed before that work can be moved to done. Again, the acceptance criteria, when I think about what that customer or stakeholder or whomever is going to hold or use what we're making, that's complete before we move it to done.
And the way it was described to me with acceptance criteria is a good acceptance criteria should let anyone walk up to the Scrum board, grab a PBI, a product backlog item, read the acceptance criteria, and know everything that needs to be completed for that particular thing, that item, to be moved from the doing or from the do to the doing to the done column. It tells me what needs to be finished for this thing to be finished. And that sounds simple and straightforward, but that also is an area where we see a lot of pitfalls, a lot of shortcuts, and people not fully accepting, or not accepting is not quite the right word, but not following what the core concept of that acceptance criteria is.
Absolutely. I set up a healthcare organization team, about 12 teams actually in the transformation. And the first few sprints, the team were writing acceptance criteria, but they quickly found out after the end of the week when they looked at the work they did and they talked as a team, they said, we were able to complete this work. And the team asked, why not? Well, I didn't understand what really needed to be done. So the acceptance criteria was failing. It wasn't complete. They had a few items in there, but as you said, Tom, when that team member pulled that work in, they weren't really 100% certain of what they needed to do. So they kind of made it up, right? So we don't want people making up things. We want it to be really, really clear. So that's a big pitfall for not including accepted, understandable, and agreed upon acceptance criteria.
And there's a flip side to that. And this is another way that an acceptance criteria can be misused. There is a line between too little information. There's kind of a sweet spot, I should say. You can have too little information, which is the scenario that you just laid out, Kevin. You can have just enough information, which is what I was talking about, where you can pull off the product backlog item and read and say, okay, once I do this, this, and this is completed, I can move on. But then you get into the other extreme, which is too much information, where you're telling people not just what needs to be done, but it suddenly becomes a direct recipe, a chain of steps that have to be taken. And that's equally bad, I understand.
Absolutely, absolutely. And some teams start to task things out, and that's what the acceptance criteria would look like. Here are the 15 steps we need to do to build a wireframe for a dashboard, per se. But to your point, you're right. It needs to be just enough information that the team can understand what needs to be done, right? That's not going to over-prescribe what they need to be doing, right? We're not robots. We know how to do the work. Bring in just enough information so you can get that thing done just good enough for MVP, for a most valuable product at the end of the sprint.
And I'm assuming part of that too, Jack, is you don't want to limit creativity and innovation by over-prescribing what has to be done.
Yeah, the analogy that I like to lean on, and we'll get to a little bit of another way that this analogy could be used with the definition of done and ready, is the bumpers of when you go bowling, right? And you're trying to avoid your team completely going and getting nothing done and landing in the gutter, but you still want to have the freedom to allow them to pick the right route to the end goal, which is to get as many pins in this case as you can. So there are a lot of different ways that, depending on the type of story you're dealing with, depending on the type of work you're doing, there are different types of acceptance criteria, structures that we use, and ways to write those out. But ultimately, it's in service of the team to be able to avoid the worst case scenarios, but still have the freedom to choose between many best case scenarios.
Sure. So when it comes down, we promised some pro tips. So when it comes down to writing an acceptance criteria, a good one, that sweet spot, getting that strike in the bowling analogy, what tips, what coaching would you give, or do you give clients and partners to make sure that they do this right?
When the product owner and the team are around writing the product backlog items, the team will ask a series of questions so that they can fully understand what's the goal and the vision of this particular story or a group of stories. This is a great placeholder for a conversation. And this is where the magic actually happens, Tom. When people are really talking to each other, asking clarifying questions. If I do this, so that what? When we move this over here, what happens? And is this what the customer really wants? What's good enough for the end of that sprint, that time box? So that conversation, a really good acceptance criteria will come out of it. People agree on it. We all understand it now as a team. Now we can say that's really ready for the sprint backlog and we can move it over.
Yeah. To kind of dive into some specifics, I said that, for different stories, we choose different options. There are a couple, quick acronyms that I can dish out as options for people to do research on.
Sure.
There's a lot of good writing out there, different kinds of acceptance criteria. The kinds that we tend to lean on are behavior-driven development, AC. That's when you write in the format of, given a context, when this event happens, then we have this outcome. The reason we use this kind of acceptance criteria is when we need to communicate, especially a business criteria to developers or to a development team or to your team in general. When we have kind of a disconnect between what the business feels is the most value and what the team feels is the most value, we write the stories in order to try to bridge that gap. There's also one of my favorites, and Kevin has seen this many times in the healthcare field, is hypothesis-driven development. It's not always true that a team works on work that is set in stone. Sometimes the team's work is to research and to discover what the actual questions and work they need to be doing are. So when we do hypothesis-driven development, we say, something like, we believe in this capability will result in this outcome, and that you will know if we have tested this successfully when we see this measurable signal. So we actually start to write our acceptance criteria in a way where, as we begin our experiment, we actually know what we're looking for and how we'll know when we've answered that question. And then once we've answered the question, we can go on from there.
So, and there's
go ahead, Kevin.
I was going to say, there's another one too. I don't know if you mentioned it or not, Jack, was the scenario-oriented acceptance criteria as well, right? Given when and then, given the precondition, when I complete an action, then I expect this result, and continue description rather when needed. So there's different, ways we can break down acceptance criteria for the different roles that Jack just described.
And the great thing here is you all have, gentlemen, just kind of laid out the fact that an acceptance criteria is not just a key element of a good product backlog item. They can actually drive the kind of product backlog item and the measurable value, the value delivered by that item. So by conceiving it in the right way and using different tools, not treating it like an afterthought, you're actually enabling a lot more high performance by making sure the team has what it needs in terms of understanding and context to drive this thing to done in a way that will deliver the desired value, or at least find if not the answer, then eliminate non-answers.
Yeah, my favorite thing about Agile and Scrum is that it's rooted in this kind of empirical philosophy, right? That and when we write our stories, it's an exercise in emotion and perspective. We're looking at the end user or the system that's going to be using this story, and we write the story accordingly. But the acceptance criteria to me is when you plug in that kind of empirical part, which is how do we actually know? How do we hold ourselves accountable to this idea that we have? How do we take it from something that is ephemeral and make it grounded?
Mm-hmm.
And I think the AC is a tool that is essential in actually bringing things back to that scientific method.
Now, we also talked about the fact that the acceptance criteria is a conversation, right? There are different ways to do it. Is there a time box? Is there a limited amount of time that somebody should spend talking about this stuff? Is there a maximum or a minimum, or how do you know if it's going well or wrong?
Well, if the team is just sort of spinning their wheel and they're not agreeing, or if they don't understand, you have to keep talking. There's no prescribed time like, okay, 5 minutes, we're going to get it done, or half hour, we're going to get it done. It's done when the team 100% understands what needs to get done. It's done when the product owner communicates to the team what needs to get done. And that team can say, okay, now we understand what the value we're going to deliver at the end of this sprint or at the end of that story when it's done. For example, if they're building a wireframe for a dashboard that medical staff use, they have to be really clear on what that wireframe is going to look like and how they're going to be building it. Once they agree on that, now they can pull that story in and go for it.
And I'm sure in your experiences with partners and clients, people have said, no, this conversation is taking too long. It's a waste of time, right? Time is money. We got to get going. Agile and Scrum, it's supposed to be about going faster, not sitting around having long conversations. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think the team kind of, self-corrects itself, because if they don't spend the time, that quality time together, coming to a clear understanding at the end of the sprint, for example, they may see something that's not done. And they say, wow, what happened? And they talk further about it. And 100% of the time, gentlemen, they always say, we didn't have a good enough acceptance criteria. Yeah. Now that's going to be their process improvement for the subsequent sprint.
Yeah, you can't run from it. It's a little bit like cutting something from a teacher's curriculum, right? Every time you cut something, it ends up resurfacing as a million first graders ask the question that you thought that you were cutting because you didn't want to do it. So the concepts that are covered in the AC always are there. They always exist. And you use the time you spend discussing and deliberating about your AC to avoid that time being wasted either in work that isn't acceptable or can't actually be considered complete, or in a longer conversation later, right? So the way that we like to advise is that if these meetings are taking a long time, either one, you just really have a big project and we're still saving time in the long run by avoiding failure, or two, if these conversations are taking a long time, it might be indicative of other, right? It might be a symptom of a completely different problem. There might be other dysfunctions that we need to talk about and flesh out that aren't really limited to the AC.
I'm assuming that would include things like, does the team really have the skill set to do the work? Are they cross-functional in that? Is this too big of a slice? Is this a story that can be cut into smaller pieces to be done better? I'm assuming this is also just, is the vision clear? And I'm guessing, and I'm wondering if this is true, that the conversations can take a while at first, but as the team gets experience and they become high performing, those conversations, the need for that conversations decrease as there's more of a shared understanding and better definitions of the project or product they're working on emerge.
Tom, you make a really good point, because right before I joined this phone call, I was coaching one of our clients. They're doing their actual first sprint, and they said the exact same thing. This is going to really take a long time. You as well, right, Jack?
Yeah, we use the dentistry analogy.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It's going to take a long time, but it is an investment up front, and it pays long dividends afterwards. So it's worth the time. We
need to get our teeth clean. We need to go to the dentist, and if we haven't done it in 4 years, it's gonna suck. But then after that, you brush, you floss, you keep it clean, and it should be a smooth.
Absolutely.
I did not expect the oral hygiene lesson, but you're absolutely right. So for the final key element, gentlemen, that we wanted to talk about, this is one that is a really, really, really sought after term, is constantly found on our website as one of the most searched terms. And that is a definition of done. And I'm going to say one of the things that we need to explain is not just what the definition of done is, but how that is actually different than an acceptance criteria? Because there's a lot of confusion there. So let's start with part one of that question. What is the definition of done?
So let me use a USDA analogy. So the USDA, they have to look at all types of food before it goes to the grocery store, right? There's thousands of different types of food. There's a whole bunch of different product backlog items in your backlog as well, but they all go through the same criteria. The food has to be fresh, has to be picked at this date, has to be packaged in a certain way, has to have the expiration date, the ingredients in it. The same thing with your product backlog items or your body of product backlog items or your definition of done. It needs to be checked here. It needs to have quality control. A person may need to look at it before it goes out. Does it fit that definition of done for that body of work, those group of product backlog items?
Yeah.
Okay. So for clarity then, a definition of done is for a group of similar items, right? An acceptance criteria is for an individual item.
Correct.
Yeah, and it gets to the perspective, right? So the acceptance criteria, the perspective that we're taking when we write them is usually still about the customer, the end user, or the next person that we're handing off something in our project to. The definition of done takes a company's perspective, and that tends to as Kevin outlined, that tends to be in a legal form, in a risk mitigation form, in quality control. There are sometimes hard requirements that we don't choose because we want to delight our customers that we still have to comply with. And that often comes in the form of a definition of done to make sure that our teams are innovative, but they're not breaking the law.
And I understand that, Jack, but I mean, it can also go another one. I'll use a personal example here, which has nothing to do with regulatory requirements or, legal stuff. I work obviously on a team that does a lot with communication. When we do blogs, all of our blog posts, there is a definition of done for any kind of blog, but each blog post will have an individual acceptance criteria based on its individual characteristics.
Yeah.
So it can be a batch item or, smaller things. So if you can group something together, like if you're an auto manufacturer, I assume all tires must meet, this definition of done, but certain tires, each individual tire, front, back, whatever, could have its own acceptance criteria.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great analogy, I think. And to kind of link together with something we brought up way back, if you can remember 10 minutes ago as the podcast started, when you're passing off between teams, we want to make sure that if I'm trying to hand off work to another team, that my definition of done matches their definition of ready. Right. So it becomes a tool for all sorts of external facing ideas and external facing requirements so that we're not giving people work that is not actually done. Right. So it's about knowing when we're finished.
And now we get back into that interlocking nature of this conversation. We're going back to where we began. So a good definition of done or acceptance criteria, if it's not a batch item, and this is something that needs to go off to another team, it's an increment that's going somewhere else. It has to then make sure to match the definition of ready so that next team can work on it. And you keep building those increments, stacking them together until you end up with the finished product.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Absolutely.
It's great.
The final thing I would say, or my final question is this. If you both have had a lot of experience with clients, what is the most common mistake you have seen with definition of done? And what would you tell people to make sure they do with all of their definitions of done?
The most common mistake I see with definition of done is that the organization has not thought deep enough about it. That's the really first mistake. The second thing, when it comes to the realization that they need a definition of done, they take too much time and waste too much time coming up with a definition of done versus having one of the teams make up a definition of done for their body of work and then start to scale that to other parts of the organization. So in other words, I'm saying come up with a reference model for your definition of done in your process, how you create it and how you look at it. Test that, inspect and adapt it, and then scale it to the other parts of the organization.
Yeah. Kind of to echo Kevin's sentiments, the DOR is not actually in the Scrum guide, I believe. It's a recommended practice, much like backlog refinement, that is kind of taken on this unofficial official status, where the reason why it exists and therefore the biggest problem that we see is that if you don't do it, things tend to go south unless you have really squeaky clean communication. So to me, the thing that I see that is the worst is definitions of done that exist to check a box rather than as a tool of communication between the team to actually understand our work better, or between teams to understand how we can make sure that work is flowing. Because we've all lived in worlds where you pass off your work to another team and they're like, this is completely unusable, right? And if we're using our definitions of done as window dressing rather than as a conversation starter where we're getting people involved, then it's not going to be useful enough to be worth the time. So we got to talk.
Yes, we do.
And
you both did, and I want to thank you very much for that. Jack Harmoning and Kevin Ball, I really appreciate your time.
Hey, thanks.
Thank you, Tom.
And if you would like to know more about patterns, techniques, case studies, and more on successful agile transformations in Scrum, or to learn about how you can partner with Scrum Inc. to drive better results starting now, visit our website, scruminc.com.